The most dangerous person in your life has perfect access to you, knows every weak point you have, and has never once been late. That person is you. Specifically, it's the version of you that operates before you've had a chance to think. Most people go through their entire lives convinced their emotional problems come from the outside. The difficult boss, the disappointing relationship, the circumstances that keep refusing to cooperate. They spend enormous energy trying to rearrange external conditions, believing that if the outside would just settle down, the inside would follow. It doesn't work that way. Your emotional life is not a weather system you're standing inside of. It's a machine you've been running. You built it. You maintain it. And for most people, they've never once opened the hood. What's inside is not pretty, but it is interesting. There are patterns in there that date back decades. Reactions that were installed before you had language for them. Automatic responses so fast and so practiced that they feel like personality. They're not personality, they're history, and history can be revised. This is not a book about becoming emotionless. Emotionless is not the goal, and anyone selling you that should be avoided. The goal is something more specific and more useful, to create just enough space between what happens to you and what you do about it, that you get to choose. That gap, small as it sounds, is the difference between a life you're building and a life you're reacting to. 15 shifts. Some of them will feel obvious once you hear them. That's fine. Obvious things can still be unlearned. Others will be uncomfortable. That's also fine. Discomfort is usually the sound of something accurate arriving. You don't need to be broken to benefit from this. You just need to be honest about the gap between who you think you are emotionally and what actually happens when things get hard. Let's find out what's actually in there. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1: The Automation Problem. You have made approximately 0 of your emotional decisions today. That's not an insult. It's a description of how the system works. The vast majority of your emotional responses, the irritation, the anxiety, the sudden deflation when something doesn't go your way, none of that went through a decision process. It was executed automatically. By programming that was written so long ago, you don't remember the install. Here's what actually happens. You encounter a situation. Before your conscious mind has formed a complete thought about it, your brain has already scanned it for threat, cross-referenced it against your emotional history, assigned it a danger rating, and begun preparing a response. All of this occurs in milliseconds. By the time you think you're reacting, you've already reacted. The experience of choosing is mostly retrospective. You react, then you construct a story about why the reaction made sense. I thought I was choosing. I wasn't. Psychologists call this confabulation. You can call it something less clinical. You call it your personality. This is where it gets uncomfortable. The scripts running your emotional life were not written by your adult self. They were written by a much younger version of you, operating with limited information, under conditions that no longer exist. A child who learned that anger was dangerous wrote a script about staying small. A teenager who got humiliated wrote a script about never being visible. A young adult who got blindsided wrote a script about trusting no one. Those scripts are still running. Right now. Today. I watched a colleague, smart, genuinely capable, torpedo a promotion conversation because his boss used a particular tone. Not the words, the tone. Something about it matched a frequency from 20 years earlier and he was gone. Not in the room anymore. Somewhere else entirely. Running an old script in a new situation. He didn't notice until 2 days later. The scripts are not stupid. That's the part people miss. They were adaptive. They worked. In the original context, they were survival tools. The problem isn't that they're broken. The problem is that they don't know the situation changed. They're loyal and outdated, like a soldier still guarding a post after the war ended. Identifying your scripts requires a specific kind of attention. Not self-criticism, not psychoanalysis, just honest observation. Start noticing the situations where your reaction seems disproportionate. Too fast, too intense, too familiar. Disproportionate reactions are almost always old scripts. The size of the response tells you the age of the material. The question is never just what triggered you. It's what the trigger reminded you of. Those are two very different investigations, and only the second one goes anywhere useful. There's also a subtler version of this worth naming. Some scripts don't look like reactions. They look like preferences. The person who always deflects with humor when things get serious. The one who goes quiet instead of saying what they need. The one who preemptively withdraws before anyone gets close enough to leave. These aren't personality traits. These are strategies that calcified. You can't rewrite scripts you haven't read. So the first shift is simply this. Begin treating your emotional reactions as data rather than truth. When you feel something strongly and quickly, get curious instead of certain. Ask what story is running. Ask whose voice that is. Ask whether the situation you're actually in matches the situation your nervous system thinks it's in. Most of the time, it doesn't. The gap between those two situations is where your actual freedom lives. Not in the grand moments of crisis, but in the ordinary Tuesday afternoon when something small happens and you catch the script half a second before it runs. That half second is everything. Chapter 2. The False Alarm Factory. Your brain is running security software designed for a world that no longer exists, and it cannot be uninstalled. That's not a metaphor. It's a fairly accurate description of your amygdala, the ancient alarm system sitting at the base of your brain that has one job: keep you alive. It does this job with extraordinary speed and absolutely zero nuance. It does not distinguish between a predator and a passive-aggressive email. It does not differentiate between physical danger and social embarrassment. It scans for threat, finds something that resembles threat, and fires. By the time your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for reasoning, perspective, and not saying things you'll regret, gets involved, the alarm has already been running for several seconds. You are already flooded, already narrowed, already operating from a much older, much less sophisticated part of your brain than you think you are. This is the hijack, and it happens to everyone, including the people who believe it doesn't happen to them, especially those people. Here's what the hijack actually feels like from the inside. It feels like clarity. That's the cruel part. When your amygdala fires and your prefrontal cortex goes partially offline, you don't experience confusion. You experience certainty. Everything feels obvious. The threat is real. Your response is justified. The other person is clearly wrong. This sense of sudden, sharp clarity is one of the most reliable signs that rational thinking has temporarily left the building. The emotions that follow are real. The interpretation driving them is often not. I once sat in a meeting where two people had an argument so heated it nearly ended a professional relationship. Afterward, when both had calmed down, Neither could clearly explain what the original disagreement had actually been about. The content had become irrelevant within 90 seconds. What remained was pure activation. Two nervous systems in alarm mode, defending against threats that had stopped being about the meeting about 4 exchanges in. Both of them were completely convinced they'd been thinking clearly the entire time. The average person gets hijacked within 17 minutes of waking up. Not from anything serious, from a notification, a headline, a minor frustration. The nervous system spikes, stress hormones enter the bloodstream, and the rest of the morning runs slightly hotter than it needed to. That heat compounds. By midday, reactions that would have been minor at 7 a.m. feel significant. By evening, exhaustion makes regulation harder, and small things land like large ones. This is not weakness. This is biology operating exactly as designed. The problem is the design was optimized for a world full of immediate physical threats, not a world full of ambient information and complex social dynamics. Your nervous system was never updated for the current environment. It's running ancient firmware on modern problems. But here's what matters. You can work with the hardware. The hijack is fast, but it is not invisible. It has a physical signature. For most people, it arrives as tension in the jaw or shoulders, a tightening in the chest or stomach, a subtle quickening of breath. These sensations precede conscious awareness of the emotion by a measurable fraction of a second. That fraction is your window. Learning to catch the physical signal before the emotion fully activates is one of the most practically useful skills in this entire book. Not because you can stop the alarm from going off, you often can't, but because you can recognize it as an alarm rather than a fact. The alarm going off doesn't mean the building is burning. It means the detector triggered. Those are different situations requiring different responses. The 90-second rule is worth understanding here. When an emotion is triggered, the neurochemical response in your body, the actual hormonal flood, lasts approximately 90 seconds before it begins to dissipate naturally. 90 seconds. After that, the only thing keeping the emotional state alive is your thinking. The stories you add, the justifications you construct, the mental replays. Most people never let the 90 seconds pass. They immediately begin narrating. And the narration re-triggers the alarm, which releases more hormones, which generate more narration. The loop runs indefinitely, and all of it feels like a single continuous emotion when it's actually a series of reactivations driven by thought. The shift is small and significant. When triggered, don't immediately interpret. Wait. Breathe. Let the initial wave move through without adding the story that keeps it circling. You are not required to think about the thing that just triggered you. Not yet. Not for 90 seconds. That pause, genuinely uncomfortable, genuinely useful, is the difference between a reaction and a response. Between executing an old script and writing a new one. Your brain will tell you the pause is dangerous, that you need to act now, that this situation is urgent. It's almost certainly wrong. Chapter 3. How Brains Become Habits. The same mechanism that can transform your emotional life is the exact mechanism that made it this way in the first place. That's either encouraging or deeply inconvenient, depending on where you're standing. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to physically reorganize itself based on repeated experience. Every thought you repeat, every emotional pattern you run, every behavior you practice is literally reshaping your neural architecture. The brain is not a fixed structure. It is a living system that continuously rewires itself according to use. What gets used grows. What gets ignored shrinks. This is genuinely good news. It means nothing about you is permanent. It also means you have been actively building your current emotional patterns, whether you intended to or not. Here's how it works at the structural level. Neurons that fire together wire together. When a particular emotional response gets triggered repeatedly, say, anxiety in response to uncertainty, or anger in response to criticism, the neural pathway for that response gets stronger with each repetition. More insulated, faster, more automatic. What starts as a reaction becomes a habit. What starts as a habit becomes what feels like personality. The pathways that see the most traffic become the brain's default routes. Not because they're correct, because they're familiar. This is why emotional patterns seem to intensify over time rather than fade. The anxious person doesn't just stay anxious, they become more efficiently anxious. The brain optimizes for what it practices. It doesn't evaluate whether the practice is useful. It just gets better at whatever it's given. I spent several years running a low-grade irritability that I'd completely stopped noticing. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a baseline slightly below neutral, a kind of ambient readiness to be bothered. I thought it was just how I was wired. It wasn't. It was what I'd practiced long enough for it to feel like wiring. The distinction matters. Here's the other side of the same mechanism. Every time you consciously choose a different response, pause instead of react, curiosity instead of defensiveness, breath instead of escalation, you are physically creating a new neural pathway. At first, that pathway is weak, thin, effortful to access. The old pathway is a 6-lane highway. The new one is a footpath through tall grass, but the footpath gets walked and walked again. And gradually the grass flattens, the path widens, and what required enormous conscious effort begins to feel natural. Meanwhile, the old highway, no longer maintained, starts to deteriorate. Not disappear. Old pathways rarely disappear entirely, but weaken. Become less automatic, less loud. This process is real, measurable, and non-negotiable. It also takes longer than anyone wants it to. Research consistently points to 66 days as a rough threshold for forming a new behavioral habit. For emotional patterns, which are older, deeper, and more neurologically entrenched than simple behaviors, the timeline is longer. Closer to 90 days of consistent practice before new responses begin to feel genuinely automatic. Most people quit somewhere around day 12, conclude the approach doesn't work, and return to the old highway. The brain doesn't care about your motivation. It cares about repetition. There's also a component of neuroplasticity that people consistently underestimate: mental rehearsal. Your brain does not cleanly distinguish between a vividly imagined experience and a real one. The neural pathways activated during detailed visualization are the same pathways activated during actual experience. This is not mysticism. It's measurable on brain scans. What this means practically is that you can train emotional responses during calm moments by imagining the triggering situation clearly and practicing the new response in your mind. Athletes have understood this for decades. A sprinter who mentally rehearses the race thousands of times before competing is not doing a visualization exercise. They are literally training their nervous system. You can do the same. Imagine the difficult conversation. Feel the familiar tightening begin. Then practice, in your mind, with full physical attention, choosing differently. Breathing, staying present, responding from the version of you that exists after the hijack passes. Done repeatedly, this is not mental preparation. It is neural construction. The uncomfortable implication of all this is straightforward. Right now, today, your brain is being rewired by your emotional experiences. This is happening whether you're directing it or not. The only question is whether you're building the architecture intentionally or accidentally. Most people are building accidentally. They rerun old emotional patterns, strengthen old pathways, and then experience those patterns as fate. They're not fate. They're infrastructure. And infrastructure, given enough time and consistent effort, can be rebuilt. Chapter 4. The 4 things that actually matter. There are exactly 4 emotional capacities that determine the quality of your inner life. Not 14, not 40. 4. And the interesting thing is not that people lack all of them. It's that most people have accidentally developed one, mistaken it for the whole thing, and spent years confused about why they keep failing in the same specific ways. The first capacity is awareness. This sounds simple enough that most people skip past it. They shouldn't. Emotional awareness is not knowing that you have emotions. It's knowing what you're feeling precisely while you're feeling it, before it has fully activated and taken over the room. Most people operate with a significant delay between the onset of an emotional state and their awareness of it. They realize they're angry after they've already said the thing. They recognize the anxiety after they've already avoided the situation. The emotion runs its program and they catch the receipt. Real emotional awareness collapses that delay. It requires training attention on the body, not as a self-improvement exercise, but because the body receives emotional information before the conscious mind does. Tension in the jaw, constriction in the chest. A particular quality of stillness that precedes a reaction. These physical signals are the emotion in its early form, before it becomes behavior. Learn to read them early and you get options. Miss them and you get outcomes. The second capacity is regulation. This is where most self-development content lives, and for good reason. It's the most practically visible skill. But regulation is widely misunderstood. Most people think it means calming down. It doesn't. It means influencing the intensity and duration of an emotional state without suppressing it. Suppression is not regulation. Suppression pushes emotion underground, where it builds pressure and resurfaces sideways, as sarcasm, as distance, as a disproportionate reaction to something minor 3 weeks later. Real regulation means staying in contact with the emotion while maintaining enough composure to choose your response. The breath is the most reliable entry point. Not because deep breathing is magical, but because your breathing pattern is the one part of your autonomic nervous system you can consciously control, and it directly communicates with the nervous system about whether you're safe. Slow, deliberate exhales activate the parasympathetic system. The body interprets them as a signal that the threat has passed. Stress hormones begin to decrease. The prefrontal cortex comes back online. This works even when you know exactly what you're doing and why. The mechanism doesn't require belief. The third capacity is resilience, and this is the one most people think they have more of than they do. Resilience is not how much you can endure. It's how quickly you recover. 2 people can experience the same setback. One is back to baseline in 48 hours. The other is still processing it 3 weeks later. The difference is not sensitivity, it's recovery architecture. Low resilience doesn't announce itself as weakness. It announces itself as rumination. as replaying conversations, as a criticism delivered on a Tuesday still sitting heavily on a Friday, as a rejection that becomes a referendum on your fundamental worth rather than a single data point. Resilient people are not less affected by difficult things. They allow the emotion to move through rather than setting up residence. They feel the impact fully, and then, at some point, they stop re-triggering themselves. The fourth capacity is relational emotional intelligence, the ability to read and respond effectively to other people's emotional states. This is the most undervalued of the four, possibly because it requires shifting attention outward at the exact moment most people are most focused inward. Most people in emotionally charged situations are almost entirely focused on managing their own internal state, which is understandable, but it means they're half blind. They're missing what the other person's body is doing, how their energy has shifted, what emotion is underneath the words being used. They're responding to the content of what's being said and missing the emotional subtext entirely. The subtext is usually where the actual situation lives. I have had conversations where someone was technically saying reasonable things while every physical signal they were sending, the stillness, the measured pace, the careful word choice, communicated something completely different. I responded to the words. I should have responded to the room. These four capacities are not independent. They compound. Strong awareness makes regulation easier because you catch the emotion earlier. Better regulation builds resilience because you're not burning resources on suppression. Greater resilience improves relational intelligence because you have more cognitive space available when you're not managing your own reactivity. They also fail in sequence. Poor awareness means regulation happens too late. Late regulation means resilience gets tested unnecessarily. Depleted resilience means relational intelligence disappears first, because reading other people is a high bandwidth activity, and it's the first thing dropped when you're running on empty. Most people don't have a generalized emotional problem. They have a specific gap in one of these four areas that creates the appearance of a generalized problem. Find the gap. That's where the work actually is. Chapter 5. The Daily Architecture. Emotional strength is not built during crises. It is built in the ordinary minutes before the world gets its hands on you. This is the part most people get backwards. They assume emotional resilience is something you call on when things go wrong, a reserve you draw from under pressure. It isn't. It's infrastructure. An infrastructure has to be constructed before you need it, not while you're standing in the wreckage wondering why it isn't there. The morning is where this starts. Not because mornings are special, but because the first hour of your day sets a neurological tone that influences every interaction, decision, and emotional response that follows. Your nervous system enters the day in a particular state. That state is either something you chose or something that was chosen for you by whatever you encountered first. Most people hand that choice to their phone within minutes of waking up. The phone is not neutral. It is an input device delivering a continuous stream of information specifically engineered to generate emotional activation, urgency, comparison, outrage, anxiety. Not because anyone designed it to harm you, but because activation drives engagement, and engagement is the product. You pick it up before you've fully transitioned out of sleep, before your prefrontal cortex is fully online, and you immediately begin processing emotionally charged content. You then spend the rest of the morning in a mild, reactive state that feels completely normal because it happens every day. This is not a small thing. A nervous system that begins the day in activation carries that activation forward. Interactions run slightly hotter. Patience runs slightly thinner. The threshold for getting triggered drops without you noticing it dropped. By the time something genuinely difficult happens, you are already depleted, not from that thing, but from the accumulated friction of a day that started reactive and never fully recovered. The alternative is not complicated. It requires about 15 minutes and a willingness to be deliberately boring before the world gets interesting. Before the phone, before the news, before any input arrives from outside. 3 breaths, not as a ritual, as a physiological reset. Long exhale, slower than the inhale. Repeat. You are telling your nervous system, through the one channel it responds to unconditionally, that you are not currently under threat, that this morning is not an emergency. Then, briefly, set an emotional intention. Not a goal, not an affirmation, a single honest question. How do I want to show up today? The question is not rhetorical. Sit with it for 10 seconds. Let an actual answer arrive. Calm, patient, direct, whatever is true and needed. The act of asking primes your attention to notice when you're drifting from it. Then, if you have 5 more minutes, run a brief mental rehearsal. Think about the most emotionally demanding thing on your schedule. Imagine it clearly. The room, the people, the moment it gets difficult. Then imagine yourself responding from the version of you that has already done the work. Not perfectly, not heroically, just regulated, present, choosing. Your brain will begin preparing that response. Not metaphorically, neurologically. Throughout the day, the work is simpler than it sounds. Check in with your emotional state every 2 hours. Not an involved process. A 10-second scan. What am I feeling right now? Where is it in my body? Is this state serving what I'm trying to do, or running underneath it and distorting it? Most people discover, when they start doing this, that they've been operating in emotional states they hadn't consciously registered for hours at a time. Mild frustration masquerading as focus, low-grade anxiety presenting as productivity, residual irritation from a morning conversation coloring an afternoon one. You cannot regulate what you haven't noticed. When a trigger hits during the day, and it will, the protocol is 3 words: pause, breathe, choose. Not as a mantra, as a sequence. The pause interrupts the automatic script. The breath brings the prefrontal cortex back online. The choice, even a small one, even just the choice of tone, begins to replace the old pattern with a new one. 3 seconds. That's the investment. But those 3 seconds, practiced consistently, are where the rewiring actually happens. The evening matters too, though differently. The purpose of an evening practice is not preparation, it's clearance. Your nervous system accumulates emotional residue throughout the day. Unprocessed reactions, unresolved tensions, minor activations that never fully discharged. If you carry that residue into sleep, it compounds. You wake up slightly more reactive than the day before, 10 minutes before sleep. Review the emotional texture of the day without judgment. Where did you get triggered? How did you respond? Not to criticize, to notice patterns. Then consciously release the tension in your body, starting from the top and working down. Then identify one thing, just one, that you're genuinely grateful for. Not as positive thinking, as a neurological counterweight to a brain that defaults to threat detection. The entire protocol takes 20 to 25 minutes a day, morning and evening combined. That's it. What it produces, over 90 days of consistency, is not a transformation you can point to. It's subtler than that. You notice one day that something that would have triggered you last month didn't. Not because you managed it, because the reaction simply wasn't as loud as it used to be. That's the architecture working. Quietly. Exactly as designed. Chapter 7. Your triggers are a map. Most people treat their triggers like interruptions, inconvenient emotional events that derail their day and reveal embarrassing things about their self-control. They manage them, suppress them, apologize for them, and wait for the next one with low-grade dread. This is the wrong relationship entirely. Your triggers are not interruptions. They are the most precise diagnostic information your nervous system is capable of producing. Each one points directly at something specific: an unresolved experience, an unmet need, a belief about yourself or the world that was formed under pressure and never revisited. They are coordinates, and if you learn to read them instead of just survive them, they will show you exactly where the actual work is. The first step is mapping with precision. Most people have a vague sense of what bothers them. They know they don't like criticism or conflict or being ignored, but vague awareness produces vague results. What's needed is surgical specificity, not just criticism. Criticism about what, specifically? Your competence? Your judgment? Your effort? Your character? These are different triggers with different origins and different maps. The person who collapses under criticism of their intelligence is carrying something completely different from the person who can hear their work critiqued but cannot tolerate being called lazy. The specificity tells you where the wound actually is. Spend 30 days keeping a trigger journal. Not an emotional diary, a precise log. Every time you get activated, record 4 things: the situation, the exact trigger within the situation, where you felt it in your body, and the immediate story your mind told about what the trigger meant. Look for the pattern not in the situations, but in the stories. The situations will vary. The stories will repeat. The repeated story is the map. Common patterns, when examined honestly. Triggers around competence usually trace back to environments where worth was conditional on performance. Triggers around exclusion usually trace back to experiences of genuine abandonment or rejection during formative years. Triggers around control, the fury that arrives when you feel managed or overridden, usually trace back to situations of powerlessness that were never resolved. The trigger in the present is almost never about the present. The size of the reaction confirms this. A response that's proportionate to the actual situation is a response. A response that's disproportionate, faster, larger, harder to regulate than the situation warrants, is an old wound recognizing a familiar shape. Once you've identified the map, the next step is reprocessing. This is where most people get uncomfortable, because reprocessing requires going toward the origin rather than away from it. The mechanism is this. Your emotional memory of a difficult experience is stored with the emotional state you were in when you formed it. A child who was humiliated in front of peers stored that memory alongside the helplessness, shame, and powerlessness of being a child with no recourse. Every time a similar situation occurs in adult life, the trigger doesn't just activate the memory. It activates the emotional state it was stored with. You don't just remember being powerless. For a moment, neurologically you are. Reprocessing works by accessing that memory from your current state. With adult resources, adult perspective, adult capacity, and consciously updating the emotional context. You are not trying to erase the memory. You are updating the file. The child who had no recourse became an adult who does. The person who was powerless then has power now. The situation that was genuinely threatening then is not genuinely threatening now. Bringing your current self into the stored experience, clearly, deliberately, with compassion for the younger version of you who made the best sense of it they could, begins to detach the old emotional state from the memory. It doesn't always work quickly. Some material requires professional support to process safely, but the direction is always the same: toward, not away. The second technique is trigger rehearsal, and this one is more immediately practical. Once you know your specific triggers, you can practice new responses to them before they occur. Not during the activation, when your prefrontal cortex is compromised, but in calm moments when your full cognitive capacity is available. Sit with the trigger clearly in mind. Feel the early physical signals begin. Then, deliberately, practice the new response. Breathe. Stay in the room. Respond from the present rather than from the history. Do this repeatedly, vividly, until the new response has been practiced more often in imagination than the old response has been run in reality. This sounds abstract. It produces concrete results, because the neural pathways for the new response are being built during calm rehearsal and are then available, not perfect, but available, when the real situation arrives. I used to get activated by a very specific tone, not what people said. The particular register of voice that communicated mild contempt while maintaining plausible deniability. I couldn't always name it in the moment. I just found myself suddenly cold and strategic in a way that wasn't actually useful. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to trace it back to something specific. Once I did, the trigger didn't disappear, but it lost its automatic quality. I started catching it half a second earlier. That half second changed what I did with it. The third technique is deliberate exposure. Controlled, graduated, chosen. Not flooding. Not throwing yourself into the deep end of your most activating situations and hoping to survive. Graduated exposure means starting with the mildest version of the trigger you can handle without becoming overwhelmed. Practicing regulation in that version. Then, as your capacity grows, moving incrementally toward more intense versions. Each successful navigation of a trigger does two things simultaneously. It updates the threat assessment in your amygdala, filing direct evidence that you can handle this, and it strengthens the neural pathway for the regulated response. You are building immunity and infrastructure at the same time. The fourth shift is perspective, and it's the one that makes the work sustainable over the long term. As long as triggers feel like enemies, you'll manage them with resistance. Resistance is exhausting. It requires constant vigilance and produces chronic tension. When you begin treating triggers as teachers, specific, pointed, occasionally brutal teachers who are showing you exactly where your nervous system still needs updating, the relationship changes. Not because the triggers become pleasant. They don't. But because they stop feeling like evidence that something is wrong with you and start feeling like information about where the work is. The triggers that bother you most are showing you the most important things. They are not your weakness. They are your curriculum. Chapter 8. Pressure is a different country. Everything works fine until the stakes are real. This is not a criticism. It is a description of a universal phenomenon that almost nobody talks about honestly. You can be genuinely skilled at emotional regulation in ordinary life, patient, measured, self-aware, and then walk into a high-pressure situation and find that most of what you practiced has become temporarily unavailable. Not forgotten, not broken, just not there when you reached for it. Pressure is not a more intense version of normal stress. It is a categorically different state. The neurological conditions under genuine pressure, high stakes, real consequences, time constraints, uncertainty, the feeling that something important could go wrong, are different enough from ordinary conditions that skills developed exclusively in calm environments often fail to transfer. This is why preparation matters more than people think, and why the specific nature of that preparation matters enormously. Most emotional training happens in comfortable conditions. People meditate in quiet rooms. They practice breathing exercises when they're already calm. They rehearse difficult conversations in their minds when they're relaxed and resourced. All of this has value, but it builds skills that are calibrated for comfortable conditions. When the actual pressure arrives, when the stakes are real and the clock is running and something genuinely important is on the line, the comfortable conditions version of you shows up and discovers the environment has changed. Elite performers in high-stakes fields understand this problem and solve it the same way. They train under conditions more demanding than actual performance. Not to be punished, to calibrate. When training is harder than the real situation registers as manageable. You can apply the same logic. Deliberately create pressure in low-stakes environments. Set artificial deadlines that are tighter than necessary. Have the difficult conversation you've been avoiding when nothing critical depends on the outcome. Take on responsibility in situations where failure is survivable. Practice regulation while genuinely activated, not while imagining activation, but while actually experiencing it. The nervous system learns from direct experience more than from any other source. If your only experience of staying calm is in the absence of pressure, you have not yet trained for pressure. You have trained for calm. The breath protocol under genuine pressure is worth addressing specifically because breathing changes first when pressure arrives, and most people don't notice until the change is already affecting their cognition. Under pressure, breathing becomes shallower and faster. This is automatic. The sympathetic nervous system accelerates it as part of the activation response. The problem is that shallow, fast breathing sends a continuous signal to the brain that threat is present, which maintains the activation state, which keeps the breathing shallow. The loop runs. Box breathing interrupts it. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out, 4 counts hold. Repeat. The specific mechanism is the hold after the exhale, a brief, deliberate pause that activates the parasympathetic system and begins counteracting the sympathetic activation. The brain receives a contradictory signal, the breathing pattern of someone who is calm, arriving in a body that is not. Gradually, the body follows the signal. The key is to begin the protocol before you're overwhelmed, not when you're already flooded. The moment you recognize pressure building, the slight acceleration, the narrowing of attention, the sense that everything is speeding up, that's the moment to start. Early application of the protocol prevents the full hijack. Late application tries to reverse it. Prevention is dramatically easier. Under genuine pressure, your mind will generate catastrophic content with impressive creativity and speed. Worst-case scenarios, comprehensive inventories of everything that could go wrong. Vivid projections of failure and consequence. This is not pessimism. It's your threat detection system doing its job with the resources it has available, which under pressure are considerable. The content feels important. It mostly isn't. The technique that works here is tunnel focus. Consciously, deliberately narrowing your attention to the single most immediate action required. Not the outcome, not the consequences, not the full scope of the situation. The next action. Just that. Under pressure, the mind wants to hold everything at once. The full complexity of the situation, all possible outcomes, every variable. This is cognitively impossible and emotionally destabilizing. Tunnel focus doesn't ignore the complexity. It temporarily sets it aside in favor of the one thing that can actually be acted on right now. I once watched someone give a presentation in a room that had turned hostile, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Questions were pointed. The energy was skeptical. I could see the moment they registered it, because everything changed slightly. The pace accelerated. The answers got longer. The pauses disappeared. They were managing the room's reaction rather than delivering their content. They recovered, but it cost them the second half. What they needed in that moment was tunnel focus on one thing: the next sentence. Not the room's opinion, not the outcome. The next sentence. Pressure also creates a physical energy that most people try to suppress. The heightened heart rate, the muscle tension, the sense of activation in the chest. These feel like anxiety, and the instinct is to calm them down. But that activation is not inherently negative. It is physiological preparation. The same state that anxiety inhabits is also the state that peak performance inhabits. The difference between them is not the physical experience. It's the interpretation. People who perform well under pressure have generally learned to interpret activation as readiness rather than threat. Not through positive thinking, through accumulated experience of activating, performing, and surviving. Each successful performance under pressure files evidence that the activation state is compatible with good outcomes. Over time, the interpretation shifts. You build that evidence base deliberately, by choosing pressure situations rather than avoiding them, by staying in difficult rooms rather than managing your way out, by finishing things under constraint rather than extending timelines to stay comfortable. Finally, recovery after pressure is not optional. Sustained activation depletes neurological resources. After a genuinely high-pressure situation, even one you navigated well, your emotional threshold drops. Things that wouldn't normally trigger you now might. Patience that's usually reliable becomes scarce. Most people move directly from one high-pressure situation to the next, without recovery, accumulating a deficit that eventually produces a reaction they can't explain. The recovery doesn't need to be elaborate. Physical movement to discharge stress hormones. Deliberate breathing to reset the nervous system. A period of genuine low stimulation before the next demand arrives. Pressure is not your enemy. It is a specific environment with specific requirements. Learn those requirements. Train for them directly. And pressure stops being the place where your emotional skills go to fail. It becomes the place where they're most visible. Chapter 9. The Science of Bouncing Back. Resilience is not how much you can take. It is how quickly you return. This distinction matters more than it might seem, because the popular image of resilience is wrong in a way that actively misleads people. The image is someone who doesn't break, who absorbs enormous difficulty without visible damage, who keeps moving without pausing, who treats pain as irrelevant. That image is not resilience. It's suppression with better marketing. Real resilience involves getting hit, feeling it fully, and then, at some point that is neither rushed nor indefinitely delayed, returning to baseline. The key variable is not whether you were affected, it's the recovery time. Two people lose a significant opportunity they'd worked toward for months. Both feel genuine disappointment. The sharp, specific kind that arrives when something you actually wanted doesn't happen. One of them is substantially back to functional equilibrium within a few days. The other is still processing it 3 weeks later, still running the mental replay, still extracting fresh pain from a fixed event. The difference between them is not emotional sensitivity, it's recovery architecture. Low resilience doesn't present as dramatic collapse. It presents as rumination, as the inability to stop revisiting, as a criticism from last Tuesday still occupying significant mental real estate on Friday, as a pattern of extracting maximum suffering from minimum material, taking a single difficult event and expanding it, through sustained attention and narrative elaboration, into something that fills much more space than the original event warranted. The rumination is not the emotion. It is the thinking that keeps re-triggering the emotion after the neurochemical response would have naturally subsided. Remove the rumination, and most emotional pain has a much shorter natural lifespan than people believe. This is not about minimizing genuine difficulty. Some things warrant extended processing. Loss, trauma, significant failure. These require real time and real attention. The question is whether you're processing or replaying. Processing moves. It extracts information, integrates experience, and gradually shifts your relationship to what happened. Replaying doesn't move. It returns to the same material, generates the same pain, and produces no new information. The first resilience skill is learning to distinguish between the two. Processing feels like it's going somewhere, even when it's slow and uncomfortable. Replaying feels like it's stuck. The same loop, the same emotional quality, the same conclusions arriving again. When you notice you're replaying, the intervention is not to stop thinking about it. Direct suppression of thought is largely ineffective, the white bear problem, as psychologists call it. Tell someone not to think about a white bear, and they will think about almost nothing else. The intervention is to shift the type of thinking, from narrative to analytical, from what happened to what it means going forward, from the event itself to what the event is showing you about what matters to you and where you want to go. The second skill is emotional processing with boundaries. When something difficult happens, schedule time to feel it, deliberately, consciously, with a beginning and an end. Sit with the emotion fully. Don't analyze it. Don't fix it. Don't reach for perspective. Just feel the actual physical experience of it, where it lives in the body, what texture it has, how it moves or doesn't move. Give it your complete attention for the time you've set aside, then stop. Not because the emotion is resolved, but because you gave it its time, and now you're returning to other things. You will come back. You've built it into the schedule. This is not denial. It's structured processing that prevents the emotion from occupying every available mental space simultaneously. Most people either avoid difficult emotions entirely or let them run without containment. Both approaches prolong the suffering. Structured engagement, full contact within defined limits, tends to move things faster than either extreme. The third element is the concept of anti-fragility, which is worth spending a moment with because it reframes the entire project of resilience. Nassim Taleb's distinction is precise. Some systems are fragile. They break under stress. Some are robust. They survive stress intact. Some are anti-fragile. They actually improve under stress. They need the disruption to develop. Remove the stress and they atrophy. Most resilience training aims for robust. Survive the difficulty without breaking. Return to where you were. Anti-fragile thinking aims higher. Use the difficulty as the mechanism for becoming something you couldn't have become without it. This is not a reframe you force onto fresh pain. It's a perspective you develop over time, through accumulated evidence that difficult experiences have consistently produced growth you wouldn't have chosen, but genuinely value. That evidence base takes time to build. But once it exists, it changes the emotional experience of new difficulties at the level of expectation rather than just interpretation. When you have direct personal evidence that hard things have made you more capable, the arrival of new hard things carries a different emotional quality. Not pleasant, but not purely threatening either. I came through a period of sustained professional difficulty that I would not have chosen and would not wish on anyone. I came out of it with a specific kind of clarity about what I actually valued and what I'd been doing out of habit or fear. I couldn't have gotten that clarity any other way. I'm not grateful the difficulty happened, but I'm honest about what it produced. That honesty is the beginning of anti-fragile thinking. The fourth element is identity stability under pressure. Low resilience is often, at its root, an identity problem. Not a character flaw, a structural one. When your sense of who you are is tied closely to external outcomes, your performance, other people's opinions, your current circumstances, then every setback is not just a setback. It's a threat to the self. And threats to the self activate the same defensive responses as physical threats. Resilient people have a stable sense of identity that is not primarily dependent on external validation or current circumstances. This doesn't mean they don't care about outcomes. It means their fundamental sense of who they are doesn't hinge on those outcomes. A failure is something that happened, not evidence of who they are. A rejection is data, not a verdict. Building this stability requires identifying the values and commitments that define you independent of results. Not your achievements, your principles. The way you treat people when you're losing. The quality of attention you bring when no one's watching. The choices you make when they cost you something. These don't fluctuate with circumstances. And when they become the primary foundation of your identity, rather than a secondary one, the emotional impact of external setbacks changes fundamentally. You can be genuinely disappointed without being destabilized. You can fail at something without becoming a failure. You can be rejected without becoming rejectable. The distance between those pairs, disappointed versus destabilized, failing versus failure, rejected versus rejectable, is the distance resilience lives in. Building it is slow, unglamorous work. It doesn't produce dramatic moments of transformation. It produces a quiet shift, over time, in how quickly you come back. And then one day you notice you came back faster than you expected. And then that becomes the new normal. Chapter 10. Other people's emotions are contagious. You have walked into rooms and left feeling things that weren't yours when you arrived. Most people have experienced this without ever naming it accurately. You spend an hour with someone who is anxious and leave the conversation with a low hum of unease you can't quite locate. You sit in a meeting where the energy is hostile and find yourself slightly defensive for the rest of the afternoon, even though nothing was directed at you. You have a phone call with someone who is deeply unhappy and hang up feeling heavier than you did before it started. This is not empathy. It is contagion. And the distinction matters. Empathy is a conscious act of perspective-taking, choosing to understand another person's emotional experience from the inside. Contagion is involuntary. It happens below the level of conscious awareness. Through a mechanism, your nervous system runs automatically, regardless of whether you've chosen to engage with it. The mechanism is mirror neurons, a class of neurons that activate both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing it. They evolved, most likely, to support learning through imitation and to enable rapid social coordination. They are also the biological basis for the fact that yawning is contagious, that watching someone in pain produces a mild version of that pain in the observer, and that spending extended time with emotionally dysregulated people gradually dysregulates you. You don't decide to absorb the room's emotional weather. Your nervous system does it automatically, continuously, and without asking permission. The people most vulnerable to emotional contagion are those with high empathy and low awareness of where they end and other people begin. They are often described, accurately, as sensitive. What's less often named is the specific mechanism. They are highly permeable. Emotional signals from others pass through with very little filtration. They experience other people's emotional states with unusual intensity, frequently mistake those states for their own, and then spend significant energy managing emotions that were never originally theirs. This is not a character flaw. It is an unmanaged capacity. The first skill is basic but foundational. Learn to identify your emotional baseline before you enter social environments. A brief check-in before a meeting, a conversation, a social event. What am I actually feeling right now, independent of what's about to happen? That baseline becomes a reference point. When your emotional state shifts during the interaction, you have something to compare it against. You can ask whether the shift came from something that actually happened to you, or whether you absorbed it from someone else. This question, "Is this mine?" sounds simple. It produces significant clarity when practiced consistently. The second skill is differentiation. Psychologists use this term to describe the ability to remain emotionally connected to another person while maintaining a distinct sense of your own emotional identity. To feel with someone without feeling as them. To be present with their experience without merging into it. Most people exist somewhere on a spectrum between two dysfunctional extremes. At one end is complete merger. Their emotional state becomes your emotional state automatically, with no boundary. At the other end is complete disconnection, a wall that prevents genuine contact with other people's experiences, producing interactions that feel hollow and relationships that stay permanently surface level. Differentiation is the functional middle, present enough to genuinely connect, boundaried enough to stay yourself. Building differentiation requires a specific kind of practice, deliberately staying in contact with your own physical and emotional experience while simultaneously attending to someone else's, not alternating between the two, holding both at once. Noticing when the other person's emotional state begins pulling you away from your own, and consciously returning to your internal anchor without withdrawing from the conversation. It feels, at first, like trying to rub your stomach and pat your head simultaneously. It becomes, with practice, simply how you're present with people. The third element is understanding emotional regulation modeling, one of the most practically powerful dynamics in social interaction and one of the least consciously used. Regulated nervous systems have a measurable calming effect on dysregulated ones. This is not metaphorical. It operates through the same contagion mechanism that spreads anxiety and anger, running in reverse. When you remain genuinely calm in the presence of someone who is activated, your regulated state provides a physiological template that their nervous system begins to follow. Your slow breathing influences their breathing. Your relaxed posture reduces their muscle tension. Your unhurried pace counteracts their urgency. None of this requires words. It operates below the level of content entirely. The key word is genuinely. Performed calm, the deliberate adoption of a calm exterior while internally running at full activation, doesn't produce this effect. It often produces the opposite, because the incongruence between external presentation and internal state is detectable at the level of micro-expressions, vocal tone, and subtle physiological signals that people read without knowing they're reading them. Someone who is pretending to be calm while actually panicking makes others more anxious, not less. Genuine regulation requires actually being regulated, which returns us to everything in the previous chapters. The reason to do that internal work is not only for your own benefit. It is because your internal state has real effects on the people around you, whether you intend those effects or not. I sat with someone once who was in significant distress, not a crisis, but the kind of deep, recursive worry that feeds on itself. I noticed my own instinct, which was to generate solutions quickly, to fill the space with something useful, to resolve the discomfort by being helpful. I resisted it. I slowed down deliberately, said very little, stayed present without agenda. About 15 minutes in, their breathing changed. The recursiveness broke. They started thinking rather than spiraling. Nothing I said did that. The quality of presence did. The fourth skill is conscious boundary management. Specifically, the ability to recognize when you are absorbing emotional content that is not useful to take on, and to deflect it without withdrawing from the relationship. This is different from protecting yourself from difficult emotions. There are situations where taking on emotional weight is exactly the right thing, where genuine presence with someone's pain is what they need and what the relationship calls for. Boundary management is not about avoiding those situations. It is about choosing them consciously rather than entering them by default. The specific technique is grounding, maintaining continuous awareness of your own physical presence during emotionally intense interactions. Your feet on the floor, the weight of your body in the chair, your own breath, running its own rhythm. This physical anchor keeps you present in your own body, even while you're in full contact with another person's experience. It prevents the drift into merger without requiring you to build a wall. Finally, be honest about the people in your life whose emotional states consistently dysregulate you. Not to judge them or distance yourself from them necessarily, but to interact with them with intention rather than by default. To enter those conversations with your regulation already established rather than hoping it will hold. Some people are genuinely difficult to be around. Not because they're bad people, because their nervous system, in its current state, runs at a frequency that activates yours. That's a fact worth knowing. What you do with that fact is a separate question entirely. But you can't make a conscious choice about it until you've made the observation. Chapter 11. Putting it all together without losing your mind. Most people who study emotional development end up with a collection: breathing techniques from one book, a reframing approach from another, something about triggers from a podcast, a concept about resilience they half remember from something they read 18 months ago. They have accumulated a significant inventory of individual tools, and they live in a house they cannot move through efficiently because the furniture was purchased separately and nothing quite fits together. This is the integration problem. And it is where most genuine self-development effort goes to die. The problem is not the tools. The tools work. The problem is that they were learned in isolation and are applied in isolation. One at a time, consciously, when remembered, in situations calm enough to allow for deliberate selection. Real emotional challenges do not arrive in conditions that allow for deliberate tool selection. They arrive fast, in complex situations, with competing demands, when your cognitive resources are already partially committed elsewhere. An integrated emotional system doesn't require you to select a tool. It responds automatically with the appropriate combination of tools, because that combination has been practiced together until it operates as a single movement. The difference between a person who knows emotional techniques and a person who has achieved emotional integration is the same as the difference between someone who knows the individual movements of a martial art and someone who has sparred for years. The first person can demonstrate each movement correctly when asked. The second person doesn't think about movements at all. The response emerges whole, appropriate, and fast, because it has been drilled past the level of conscious assembly. Integration is drilling past the level of conscious assembly. The first phase is skill stacking, the deliberate practice of using multiple techniques simultaneously rather than sequentially. Most people learn to breathe through activation. Then, separately, they learn to reframe. Then, separately, they practice anchoring. In real situations, they try to remember which one to use and in what order, and by the time they've decided, the moment has passed. Skill stacking means training the techniques together from the beginning of your practice. When you encounter a triggering situation in rehearsal, in your imagination, in low-stakes real situations, you don't reach for one tool. You simultaneously breathe, notice the physical signature of the emotion, question the automatic interpretation, and access the anchored state. All of this happens in the same 3 seconds. This requires deliberate practice sessions, where the explicit goal is combination rather than individual technique. Create a mildly activating situation, a difficult memory, an uncomfortable imagined scenario, a conversation you've been avoiding, and run all your techniques through it at once. The awkwardness of the early attempts is the neural pathway being built. Stay with it. The second phase is pattern interruption mastery. This is the capacity to catch an emotional pattern in its earliest detectable stage, before it has reached the point where it visibly affects your behavior, and redirect it before it runs. Early-stage detection requires developing sensitivity to very small signals, the slight shift in your breathing before you're consciously aware of being activated, the subtle tightening in a specific part of your body that reliably precedes a particular emotional response, the almost imperceptible change in your thinking, a narrowing, a speeding up, a familiar quality of certainty that indicates an old script has begun running. These signals are present in everyone. Most people simply haven't trained their attention finely enough to notice them. They experience the emotion as arriving fully formed, without warning. In reality, it announced itself several times before it became visible. They just weren't listening at that frequency yet. Training this sensitivity is less complicated than it sounds. It requires the same regular check-in practice described in the Daily Architecture chapter, applied with increasing precision over time. As you log more emotional reactions and trace them backward to their earliest physical signals, you build a personal map of your own pre-emotional signatures, your individual warning system, specific to you, calibrated to your patterns, increasingly reliable. Once the early signal is detected, the interruption is immediate and automatic. Breath, ground, choose. Not a decision tree. A single practiced movement that redirects the trajectory before the old pattern has fully activated. The third phase is contextual adaptation. Different situations require genuinely different emotional approaches, and integration means shifting between those approaches fluidly rather than carrying one default mode into every context. High-stakes professional environments often require calm confidence and decisive clarity. Intimate relationships require warmth, patience, and genuine vulnerability. Crisis situations require focus, composure, and the ability to narrow attention rapidly. Creative work often requires a kind of open, receptive presence that is incompatible with the focused intensity that serves crisis management. Most people have one or two modes they're comfortable with and apply them broadly. The person who is decisive and direct everywhere, including in situations that call for patience and listening. The person who is warm and accommodating everywhere, including in situations that require firm boundary setting and clear communication. Contextual adaptation means reading each situation accurately and accessing the emotional register it actually requires, rather than the one you're most comfortable with. This is not performance, it is range. A musician who can only play at one volume is not more authentic than one who can play at any volume. They are simply less capable. I am more naturally comfortable with directness than with sustained patience. In situations that genuinely require patience, not as a tactic, but as a genuine quality of presence, I have to consciously shift register. I can do it. It costs more than directness costs me. That's the honest version of contextual adaptation. Not effortless fluidity, conscious range. The fourth phase is emotional leadership integration, the point at which your regulated state begins producing effects in others without deliberate effort. This is less a skill you develop and more a threshold you cross through sustained practice. When your nervous system is reliably regulated, it functions as a reference point for the nervous systems around it. People feel calmer after talking to you without knowing why. Rooms you enter tend toward lower temperature. Conflicts you're present for tend to resolve rather than escalate. This is not charisma, it's physiology. And it is a real and measurable consequence of sustained emotional integration. The final phase, unconscious competence, is where you stop noticing that you're doing any of this. The techniques have been practiced past the level of conscious access. The awareness is continuous but effortless. The responses emerge appropriately without deliberate selection. This takes longer than anyone wants it to. 18 months minimum of consistent practice for most people. Sometimes longer depending on the depth of the original conditioning being replaced. The timeline is discouraging until you reframe the question. The question is not how long until I'm done. There is no done. The question is whether the person you're becoming through this practice is worth the practice. And that question tends to answer itself fairly quickly once you start actually doing the work rather than reading about it. Which brings us to the only thing that actually matters in this chapter and in this entire book. The gap between understanding something and embodying it is not closed by more understanding. It is closed by repetition. Deliberate, consistent, unglamorous repetition. Everything else is just detail. Chapter 12. The effect you have on rooms. You are already leading emotionally. You have been the entire time. The only question is whether you've been doing it consciously or accidentally. Whether the effect you're having on the people around you is the effect you would choose if you understood that you were choosing. Most people think of emotional leadership as something reserved for people with formal authority. Managers, parents, anyone with a title that implies responsibility for others. This is wrong in a way that costs ordinary people enormous influence they don't realize they have. Emotional leadership is not a function of position. It is a function of nervous system regulation. And it operates in every interaction, regardless of who is technically in charge. Every room you enter has an emotional temperature before you arrive. Your presence changes that temperature. The direction of the change, warmer or cooler, calmer or more activated, safer or more guarded, is determined primarily by your internal state and secondarily by your behavior. The internal state comes first. Behavior without the corresponding internal state is detectable as incongruent, and incongruence typically makes emotional temperatures worse rather than better. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Your emotional state is not a private experience. It is a broadcast. Your nervous system is continuously transmitting information through your vocal tone, your pace, your micro-expressions, your posture, your breathing pattern, and dozens of other channels that the people around you are reading unconsciously and continuously. They don't know they're reading it, but their nervous systems are responding to it. When you are genuinely calm, people around you feel slightly safer. When you are genuinely confident, people around you feel slightly more capable. When you are genuinely present, not managing the interaction, not running an agenda, just actually there, people feel seen in a way that is rare enough to be remarkable. The reverse is equally true and more commonly experienced. When you are anxious, the people nearest to you absorb some of that anxiety. When you are running a low-grade irritability you haven't consciously acknowledged, it shows up in the texture of your interactions as a friction people feel but can't name. When you are distracted and half-present, people sense the absence even when you're technically in the room. You are doing all of this constantly. The question is whether you're doing it intentionally. The first principle of emotional leadership is taking responsibility for your broadcast. Not in a self-conscious, monitoring way that produces its own kind of distorted signal, but in the basic sense of acknowledging that your internal state affects others and that this creates a genuine responsibility. Most people treat their emotional states as purely personal matters. My anxiety is mine. My frustration is mine. My distraction is mine. This framing is understandable but incomplete. Your emotional states are personal in their origin. They are social in their effect. The moment another person's nervous system is in proximity to yours, your state becomes partly their experience. Taking responsibility for this doesn't mean performing positivity you don't feel. It means doing the work, the actual internal work, to be in a state that serves the situations you're in and the people you're with. Not for their sake at your expense. Because a person operating from genuine regulation is also a person who thinks more clearly, communicates more effectively, and makes better decisions. The emotional leadership benefit and the personal benefit are the same work. The second principle is emotional environment design. Every interaction creates a microenvironment with a particular emotional quality. You are contributing to that quality whether you realize it or not. The question is whether your contribution is conscious. Some environments are characterized by psychological safety. People feel able to speak honestly, take small risks, acknowledge uncertainty without fear of judgment. Some are characterized by guardedness. People manage their words carefully, present polished versions of their thinking, withhold the actual concerns. The difference between these environments is not primarily structural or procedural. It is emotional, and it is set primarily by the person in the room with the most emotional authority, which is usually the person with the most stable regulation. You create psychological safety not by announcing it, but by demonstrating it, by responding to honesty without punishment, by acknowledging your own uncertainty without apparent distress, by treating mistakes, yours and others, as information rather than evidence of inadequacy, by being genuinely interested in what people think rather than in confirming what you already believe. These are not communication techniques. they are the behavioral outputs of a particular internal state. You can perform some of them temporarily without the internal state, but people will notice the gap eventually, and the trust that was building will quietly reverse. The third principle involves conflict. Specifically, the recognition that most interpersonal conflict is emotionally driven in ways that the participants cannot see while they're inside it. Two people are arguing about a decision. Technically, the argument is about the decision, its merits, its risks, the reasoning behind it. But beneath the content, there are emotional dynamics running. One person feels their judgment is being dismissed, which activates a history of not being taken seriously. The other feels their competence is being questioned, which activates a history of having to prove themselves. Neither of them is aware of these dynamics. Both of them are being driven by them. The argument about the decision is real, but the intensity fueling it is not about the decision. Emotional leaders see this layer, not because they're more intelligent than the people in the conflict, because they're regulated enough to have cognitive space available for observation rather than using all of it for self-defense. Seeing the emotional layer doesn't mean narrating it to everyone in the room. It means using the information to redirect the interaction towards something productive. Acknowledging what's actually happening beneath the content, not accusingly, not analytically, but simply and directly. That sounds like this is feeling pretty charged. What's the actual concern underneath it? It sounds like a small thing. It changes the trajectory of most conflicts immediately, because it addresses the actual problem rather than the presented one. The fourth principle is the long-term effect. Every interaction you have leaves a residue. People leave conversations with you feeling something, more capable or less, more seen or less, more settled or more agitated. That residue affects how they behave next, which affects the people they interact with, which ripples outward in ways that are impossible to track but real. This sounds abstract until you think about the specific people in your own life who have left you feeling consistently better or consistently worse after interactions with them. You probably don't remember most of what they said. You remember how you felt. You remember whether being around them made you more or less of what you were trying to be. That effect, the durable residue of how someone made you feel, is what emotional leadership actually is. It is built not in grand moments of inspiration, but in the accumulated texture of ordinary interactions. The quality of your attention during a brief conversation, the tone you use when you're tired and someone asks you something, whether you're genuinely present or slightly elsewhere in a moment that mattered to someone else. I have been the person in the room making the temperature worse while believing I was managing it well. The gap between those two things, what you think you're broadcasting and what you're actually broadcasting, closes only with the kind of honest feedback that most people are not in environments designed to provide. In the absence of that feedback, the proxy is this. How do people behave after interacting with you? Are they more open or more guarded? More energized or more depleted? More willing to be honest or more careful with their words? The answers to those questions tell you more about your emotional leadership than any self-assessment. Chapter 13. Making it a life, not a practice. The goal was never to be good at emotional regulation during your morning routine. It was to stop needing to switch modes. To become someone whose emotional intelligence is not a layer applied over ordinary life, but the texture of ordinary life itself. Not a practice you do. A person you are. Most self-development content treats emotional skills the way people treat exercise equipment, purchased in January. Enthusiastically acquired, conscientiously used for several weeks, gradually relegated to the corner of the room where it becomes expensive furniture. The skills were real. The practice was genuine. But it stayed in a separate compartment. Something done during designated time, in designated conditions, with a designated version of the self, and then life happened, in all its undesignated chaos, and the compartment was nowhere nearby. Compartmentalization is the primary reason intelligent, motivated people make limited long-term progress on emotional development. They work on it in one context and revert in others. They are patient in their meditation practice and reactive with their family. They are measured in professional settings and explosive in intimate ones. They have one version of themselves for the work and a completely different one for the rest. The integration that matters is not integrating techniques. It is integrating identity. Becoming the person who brings emotional intelligence to Tuesday afternoon the same way they bring it to the deliberately constructed morning practice. This requires dissolving the boundary between practice and life. Not by practicing less, but by expanding what counts as practice to include everything. The difficult colleague is practice. The frustrating commute is practice. The conversation with your partner at the end of a depleting day, when your patience is genuinely thin and the topic is genuinely charged, that is the most important practice. Not because it's the hardest, though it often is, but because it's where the gap between who you are in your morning routine and who you are in your actual life is most visible. The morning routine is the warm-up. Real life is the training. This reframe changes what you're looking for. Instead of hoping for smooth days where your emotional skills aren't particularly tested, you start noticing that difficult moments are the ones producing the actual development. The moment you almost snapped and didn't. The conversation you stayed present for instead of deflecting. The criticism you received without immediately constructing a defense. These are not interruptions to your practice. They are the practice. The first element of making this a life is morning preparation. Not as a ritual separate from your day, but as a genuine transition into it. The 15 minutes described in the daily architecture chapter are not valuable because they are calm. They are valuable because they establish an internal state that you carry into the day's first interactions. The state you arrive in shapes the state you create for others. The morning is where you choose what you're broadcasting before the day chooses for you. The second element is workplace integration. Most people have emotional habits at work that are entirely distinct from their self-understanding. They are more reactive under professional pressure than they would ever be in contexts they feel safe. They manage upward carefully and sideways poorly. They are diplomatic with clients and blunt with colleagues. The workplace reveals emotional patterns that comfortable environments conceal because workplaces apply the specific pressures: evaluation, comparison, status, consequence, that most people are most sensitive to. Using the workplace as a training environment means treating every professional friction as information. Not about the person who created the friction, but about the pattern the friction is activating in you. The colleague who irritates you is showing you something. The feedback that stings is showing you something. The meeting where you went quiet when you should have spoken, or spoke when you should have listened. Each of these is data that a person committed to integration collects and examines. Not to be endlessly self-critical. To be increasingly accurate about where the actual gaps are. The third element is relationship integration, which is where most people find the work hardest, because relationships are where the oldest emotional material lives. Your most important relationships contain people who have known you long enough and know your patterns well enough to activate your deepest triggers reliably and sometimes without trying. A partner who uses a particular tone. A parent whose approval still operates somewhere in your motivational structure, despite decades of apparent independence. A sibling who can locate the specific frequency that makes you 12 years old again with a single sentence. These relationships are not obstacles to emotional development. They are its most demanding curriculum. Relationship integration means bringing your full emotional capacity to the people who test it most. Not performing patience with a partner while feeling contempt. Not being physically present with family while emotionally elsewhere. Not responding to honesty with the kind of managed calm that the other person can feel is management rather than genuine. It means being real and regulated simultaneously, which is harder than being real without regulation, or regulated without being real. Both of those are easier. The combination is the work. The fourth element is physical integration. The recognition that your body is not a vehicle for transporting your brain between emotional events, but an active participant in your emotional experience. Your posture affects your confidence. Your movement patterns affect your energy. Your sleep quality affects your threshold for activation. Your nutritional choices affect your mood stability in ways that are measurable and largely underestimated. Physical integration means treating your physical practices as emotional practices, not exercise as stress relief, though it is that too, but exercise as nervous system regulation, as mood architecture, as the maintenance of a physical container capable of holding difficult emotional experiences without being overwhelmed by them. The body keeps score, as the saying goes. It also does the work. And people who ignore the physical dimension of emotional development are working with one hand. The fifth element is the posture of continuous learning. Emotional mastery is not a credential you earn and then possess. It is a direction of travel. There is no destination at which the learning stops being necessary, or the practice becomes genuinely effortless. There will always be new relationships that activate new patterns, new pressures that test new edges, new versions of old material arriving in configurations you haven't encountered before. The people who sustain long-term growth in this area are not the ones who work hardest in concentrated bursts. They are the ones who maintain genuine curiosity about their own emotional patterns over years, who treat each new activation not as evidence of failure, but as new information arriving about territory they haven't fully mapped yet. That curiosity, honest, non-defensive, genuinely interested, is the engine. Everything else is fuel. There is a version of yourself that handles the difficult conversation without rehearsing it for 3 days beforehand. That stays present in the conflict without needing to win it. That receives criticism without the machinery of self-protection immediately engaging. That sits with uncertainty without needing to resolve it prematurely. That version is not a different person. It is the current version of you, with the daily architecture maintained and the practice extended into every room you enter. The distance between here and there is not information. You already have the information. It is repetition. Honest, consistent, life-integrated repetition. That is all it has ever been. Chapter 14, When Everything Breaks at Once. There are situations that don't respond to normal emotional tools, not because the tools are wrong, because the scale is different. Because some experiences arrive at a magnitude that exceeds the operating range of techniques developed for ordinary life, and attempting to apply ordinary tools to extraordinary circumstances produces a specific kind of failure that is more disorienting than helpful. You reach for what usually works. It doesn't work. And now you have the original problem, plus the destabilizing discovery that your resources are insufficient. This chapter is about those situations, the ones that don't fit the framework. Most emotional development content implicitly assumes a relatively stable life context. Difficult conversations, workplace pressure, relationship friction, personal setbacks, these are the assumed operating conditions. And the tools developed for these conditions are genuinely effective within them. But life occasionally produces situations that are categorically different, not more difficult versions of ordinary problems. Different in kind. Acute crisis is the first category. Something terrible happens suddenly, without warning, and requires immediate response. Medical emergencies, accidents, sudden loss, violence, natural disasters. These situations share specific characteristics. They arrive without preparation time. They involve genuine threat rather than perceived threat. And they require functional behavior precisely when the nervous system is most activated. The emotional challenge of acute crisis is not regulation in the usual sense. It is a specific kind of compartmentalization, the ability to temporarily set emotional processing aside in order to do what the situation immediately requires, while maintaining enough awareness to ensure that the deferred processing actually happens later, rather than becoming permanent suppression. This is a genuine skill, and it is different from the suppression that causes problems in ordinary life. Suppression in ordinary circumstances means avoiding emotional material that is safe to process. Compartmentalization in crisis means deferring emotional material that cannot be safely processed while immediate action is required. The distinction is not philosophical, it is functional. One is avoidance. The other is sequencing. The people who handle acute crises most effectively are not people who feel less. They are people who have developed the ability to say, in effect, "not now," and mean it cleanly, without the emotional material leaking into their function. And then, critically, who actually return to the deferred processing once the immediate demands have passed. The return is not optional. Deferred emotional processing that never happens becomes stored activation. Chronic tension in the body, hypervigilance in the nervous system, a baseline reactivity that seems disconnected from present circumstances because its origin is in the past. The crisis passed. The body didn't get the news. If acute crisis is sudden and compressed, prolonged adversity is its opposite. An extended period of difficulty without clear resolution. Chronic illness. Financial devastation sustained over years. Caregiving that has no foreseeable end. Legal situations that occupy months or years of your life. Circumstances that require you to maintain emotional function not for an intense short period, but continuously under ongoing stress, without the relief of resolution. Prolonged adversity is harder than acute crisis in a specific way. Acute crisis has a physiological ceiling. At some point, the body simply cannot maintain peak activation and begins to regulate downward. Prolonged adversity never quite reaches that ceiling. It runs below it, continuously, at a level that is sustainable enough to continue but corrosive enough to gradually degrade emotional resources, cognitive capacity, and physical health. The primary risk in prolonged adversity is not breakdown. It is erosion. The slow, barely perceptible deterioration of the things that sustain you. Hope, meaning, the capacity for genuine pleasure, the sense that your actions matter. These don't disappear suddenly. They thin out gradually until one day you notice that something that used to move you no longer does, and you can't remember exactly when that changed. Managing prolonged adversity requires a different resource base than managing acute stress. It requires sources of meaning and stability that are genuinely independent of the adverse circumstances. Not circumstances-dependent hope, the belief that things will get better, but circumstances-independent meaning. The capacity to find genuine value in your experience regardless of whether the external situation resolves favorably. This is harder than it sounds, and more important than almost anything else in this book. Viktor Frankl, who developed his psychological framework while imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps, observed that the people who survived psychologically were not those with the most resources or the most advantageous circumstances. They were those who maintained a sense of meaning, a reason to endure, that the circumstances could not destroy. The meaning was internal, the circumstances were external. The two operated on separate tracks. You do not need to be in a concentration camp for this observation to apply. Any sustained adversity eventually tests whether your sense of meaning is load-bearing or decorative, whether it holds under actual weight or only looks solid when nothing is pressing on it. The third category is moral complexity. Situations where there is no clean answer, where every available choice involves real costs, where you must act under conditions of genuine uncertainty about what the right thing is. Medical decisions for people who cannot make them for themselves. Whistleblowing situations where honesty has serious personal consequences. Loyalty conflicts where keeping faith with one person requires breaking faith with another. These situations produce a specific emotional texture that is worth naming. The discomfort of not knowing whether you are doing the right thing, combined with the necessity of acting anyway. This is different from ordinary decision-making under uncertainty. The uncertainty here is not about outcomes. It is about values, about which principles take precedence when principles conflict. Most people have very little practice with this kind of uncertainty because they've spent their lives in circumstances where the right answer, while sometimes difficult, was at least theoretically clear. Moral complexity removes that clarity. It requires acting from your deepest values, while genuinely uncertain whether those values are correctly applied in the specific situation. The emotional skill required here is not regulation in the conventional sense. It is the capacity to tolerate unresolved moral discomfort without either rushing to false certainty or collapsing into paralysis. To hold the complexity without needing to simplify it prematurely. To make the best decision you can make with the information and values you have, and then live with the uncertainty about whether it was right. I have been in situations where the honest course of action was clear, and the personal cost of it was significant. I have not always chosen the honest course immediately. Sometimes I needed time to work up to what I already knew was right. I am not proud of the delay, but I am honest about it. Because pretending those delays didn't happen would make everything in this chapter less true. The fourth category is public scrutiny. Situations where you become the target of sustained criticism, misrepresentation, or attack from people who don't know you personally, but have strong opinions about you. This has always been a reality for public figures. In a hyper-connected world, it is increasingly a reality for anyone who takes a visible position on anything. Public scrutiny creates a specific emotional challenge because it attacks identity rather than behavior. It's not criticism of something you did. It's judgment of who you are, delivered by people who have limited information and no relationship with you, which means you cannot address it through normal relational repair. There is no conversation to have. There is no misunderstanding to correct. There is only the sustained presence of negative judgment in your environment. The emotional skill required is a clean separation between your internal sense of self and external assessment of you. Not indifference to feedback. Indifference to feedback makes you impossible to correct and impossible to trust. But a genuine distinction between feedback that is accurate and worth integrating, and judgment that is inaccurate and not worth internalizing. This distinction requires you to know yourself with enough clarity and honesty that you can evaluate criticism against actual self-knowledge rather than anxiety. Which means the work of this entire book, the honest self-examination, the pattern recognition, the willingness to see yourself accurately, is not just about managing emotions. It is about building the self-knowledge that makes you resistant to being defined by people who don't actually know you. The fifth category is ultimate loss. The experiences that cannot be fixed, recovered from in any ordinary sense, or reframed into growth without significant dishonesty. The death of someone central to your life. The permanent loss of a capacity you depended on. The end of something that defined you for decades. These losses are real in a way that most emotional frameworks are not equipped to address, because most frameworks are implicitly oriented toward recovery and growth. Some things don't recover. Some things don't produce growth, or produce it only after a period of genuine devastation that cannot and should not be rushed. The appropriate emotional response to certain losses is grief. Sustained, non-productive, not going anywhere quickly grief. And the appropriate support for that grief is presence, not technique. What carries people through ultimate loss is not emotional skill in any conventional sense. It is connection to other people, to meaning, to something larger than the individual self and the individual loss. The philosophical and spiritual traditions that have addressed human suffering most honestly have generally arrived at the same observation. The self that can be destroyed by loss is smaller than the self that can survive it. This is not comfort. It is direction. The direction is toward whatever in you is not contingent on what was lost, toward the part of your identity that predates the loss and will outlast the grief, not as a way of minimizing what's gone, as a way of locating what remains. These 5 categories, acute crisis, prolonged adversity, moral complexity, public scrutiny, ultimate loss, do not exhaust the ways life can exceed ordinary emotional frameworks, but they cover the territory where most people discover that what they've built is not quite sufficient for what arrived. That discovery is not failure. It is information about what needs to be built next. And the building continues. Chapter 15. Unshakable. This is not about becoming someone who doesn't get hit. That person doesn't exist. If they appear to exist, they are either extraordinarily lucky in their circumstances or extraordinarily dishonest about their experience. Getting hit is part of the operating conditions. The wind comes. The ground shifts. The thing you built your plans around changes without your permission. This is not a problem to be solved. It is the nature of the terrain. Unshakable is not a description of someone the terrain leaves alone. It is a description of someone whose roots go deep enough that the wind doesn't determine whether they remain standing. The difference is location, where you are rooted. Most people are rooted primarily in external conditions. Their sense of stability depends on circumstances cooperating, relationships remaining intact, work going reasonably well, health holding, the people they love remaining present. When those conditions are stable, they feel stable. When those conditions shift, they shift with them. Their emotional equilibrium is borrowed from the outside and is therefore subject to the outside's unpredictability. This is not weakness. It is the default human configuration. It requires deliberate work over extended time to build something different. What unshakable people have built is an internal root system, sources of stability and identity that do not depend on external conditions remaining favorable. This doesn't mean they're indifferent to external conditions. They care. They prefer good outcomes. They feel real pain when things go badly. But their fundamental sense of ground, who they are, what they stand for, what makes life worth living, is not located in those outcomes. The first element of that root system is radical self-acceptance. And this phrase is so frequently misused that it requires careful definition. Radical self-acceptance is not self-satisfaction. It is not the decision to stop growing or the belief that your current patterns are fine. It is something much more specific and much more difficult. The complete cessation of war with yourself. The end of the exhausting internal campaign to be different from what you currently are before you grant yourself the basic courtesy of your own regard. Most people live with a continuous low-level internal commentary that is adversarial. A running evaluation of current performance against an ideal standard, delivering verdicts with the consistency and mercy of a hanging judge. Too slow, too reactive. Should have handled that differently. Still making the same mistakes. The commentary is so constant it becomes ambient. The background noise of self-experience that people mistake for conscience or self-awareness. It is neither. It is self-punishment that has been running so long it feels like weather. Radical self-acceptance means turning that off. Not because self-examination is bad. Honest self-examination is essential. But because examination conducted from a posture of contempt produces distortion rather than clarity. You cannot see yourself accurately from a position of hostility toward what you see. You see what the hostility is looking for. Acceptance creates the conditions for genuine change, precisely because it removes the defensive energy that resistance to self-knowledge requires. When you are not fighting what you find, you can actually look at it. And what you can look at clearly, you can work with. The second element is transcendent purpose. Connection to something that gives your life meaning independent of how your circumstances are currently arranged. Purpose that is contingent on outcomes is not actually stabilizing. If my sense of meaning depends on the project succeeding, then the project failing doesn't just disappoint me, it empties me. The meaning was located in the outcome, and the outcome didn't arrive. Transcendent purpose is located in the direction, not the destination, in the quality of effort, not the result, in the values expressed through the attempt, not the validation received at the end. A parent whose purpose is to be genuinely present for their children has a purpose that survives every individual failure of parenting. A person whose purpose is to contribute honestly to their field has a purpose that survives rejection, obscurity, and every project that doesn't land. The purpose is not contingent on being recognized for it. That independence from recognition is precisely what makes it stabilizing. This does not require grand ambitions or world historical significance. The scale of the purpose is irrelevant. What matters is whether it belongs to you in a way that external conditions cannot confiscate. The third element is present moment mastery. Not as a meditation concept, but as a practical orientation to experience. Most emotional suffering is temporally mislocated. It is happening now, but it is about then. Either a past that is being replayed, or a future that is being pre-experienced with anxiety. The present moment, as it is actually occurring, is almost always more manageable than the accumulated past. and the projected future running simultaneously. When you are genuinely present, not as a technique, not performing presence, but actually here, you are dealing with what is actually happening, rather than what your history suggests it might mean, or what your anxiety suggests it might become. The present is almost always narrower than the story about it, and narrower is more workable. Present moment mastery is developed through the simple, repetitive practice of returning. Not staying, returning. The mind will leave the present. That is what minds do. The practice is noticing the departure and returning, without drama, without self-criticism for having left. The quality of the practice is not measured by how rarely you leave. It is measured by how quickly and cleanly you return. Over years of consistent returning, the interval between departure and return shortens. And then one day, you notice that you are simply here more than you are elsewhere. Not perfectly, not permanently, just more. The fourth element is emotional alchemy, the developed capacity to extract something real and useful from difficult emotional experience rather than simply surviving it. Every significant emotional challenge contains information. Anger is showing you something about your values, specifically, what you believe should be different and isn't. Fear is showing you something about what matters to you enough to lose. Grief is showing you something about what you loved. Shame is showing you, imperfectly, often distortedly, but showing you something about the gap between your behavior and your values. This information is not automatically delivered. It requires a specific kind of attention, one that stays in contact with the difficult emotion long enough to ask what it is actually about rather than immediately moving to manage or escape it. The question is not how do I get rid of this? The question is, what is this telling me? The alchemy is not in finding silver linings. It is in refusing to let experience pass through you without yielding what it actually contains. Difficult experiences are expensive. You are going to pay the emotional cost regardless. Alchemy means getting what you paid for. The fifth element is what I would call unconditional regard, for yourself and for others. Not unconditional approval, not the suspension of discernment or the tolerance of harm, but a baseline recognition of fundamental worth that does not fluctuate with performance, behavior, or outcome. When your regard for yourself is unconditional at its foundation, when your basic sense of your own worth is not a variable that changes with your results, the emotional experience of failure changes completely. Failure becomes something that happened, not something you are. The two feel similar when self-worth is contingent. They feel entirely different when it isn't. The same extension toward others, a baseline recognition that people's worth is not determined by their behavior toward you, creates a specific kind of freedom in relationships. You can be genuinely hurt by someone's actions without needing to reduce them to those actions in order to justify the hurt. You can set firm boundaries without requiring the other person to be a villain. You can end things that need to end without needing to make them wrong to do it. This is not sentimentality. It is precision. It is the difference between responding to what is actually happening and responding to the story your activated nervous system is generating about what is happening. When these 5 elements are genuinely integrated, not recited, not aspired to, but actually lived through consistent practice over time, something shifts that is difficult to describe without sounding grandiose. The shift is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is the experience of being less moved by things that used to move you. Not because you care less, because you are more deeply rooted than you were. The wind still comes. You notice it differently. Emotions still arrive, sometimes loud, sometimes fast, sometimes from directions you didn't anticipate. You experience them fully. You are not controlled by them. They move through you, and you are still here on the other side, unchanged at the level that matters, informed by what passed through. That is what unshakable actually means. Not still, not invulnerable, not beyond reach of pain. Rooted enough that being reached doesn't mean being toppled. The work of this book has been pointing at that root system from 15 different directions. The directions are all real. The root system is the same one, seen from different angles. You have been building it throughout. The building continues. Everything you need for the next stage is already in the practice you've already begun. You already know enough. That's not reassurance. It's a diagnosis of the actual problem. The gap between where you are emotionally and where you want to be is not an information gap. You have the information. You've had most of it for longer than you'd like to admit. The gap is a practice gap. And practice gaps close through one mechanism only: showing up repeatedly in ordinary conditions, without waiting for motivation to arrive first. Motivation is a story people tell themselves about why they haven't started yet. It feels like a prerequisite. It isn't. It is a byproduct of action, something that appears after you've already begun, not before. Waiting for it is a reliable method for remaining exactly where you are. What you do with what you now know will be determined almost entirely by what happens in the next 72 hours. Not because 72 hours is a magical window, because the pattern of beginning and not continuing is set in the first few days. The nervous system forms its expectation of whether this is something you actually do or something you consider doing. That expectation, once formed, is self-reinforcing in both directions. Begin something small and specific. Not a comprehensive overhaul. Not a complete protocol implemented simultaneously. One thing: the morning breathing practice, the trigger journal, the 2-hour emotional check-in. One thing done consistently for 2 weeks. Then add another. The architecture is built the way all architecture is built. One element at a time, each one load-bearing before the next is added. What you are building is not a skill set. You are building a version of yourself that operates differently at the level of automatic response. That version is not achieved. It is accumulated. Through thousands of small moments where you caught the reaction half a second early, where you stayed in the room instead of withdrawing, where you felt the trigger and didn't run the old script, where you were genuinely present with someone instead of managing the interaction from behind glass. None of those moments feel significant while they're happening. They are the most significant thing you will do. The person at the end of this, not the end of the book, the end of sustained practice, is not dramatically different from the person who started it. They have the same history, the same patterns, the same material, but their relationship to that material has changed. The patterns that once ran them are now patterns they observe. The history that once defined them is now something they carry without being carried by. That shift, from being run by your emotional programming to being the person who notices it running, is not a destination. It is a direction. You orient toward it. You practice in that direction. You drift and return and practice again. The quiet war ends not with a victory, but with a gradual ceasefire. The internal conflict between who you are And who you keep insisting you should be dissolves not through resolution, but through acceptance combined with honest effort. You stop fighting yourself. You start working with what's actually there. And what's actually there, underneath the old scripts, beneath the automatic reactions, past the conditioning and the history and the patterns that felt like personality, is someone considerably steadier than you've been giving yourself credit for. You have been building that person this entire time. Keep building.